So day by day, we're getting a better idea of what Trump's plan might actually be to end the war in Ukraine. And recently, it's kind of looked like the United States has softened their stance, whereas Russia continues to dig in. Now, we've got a lot of sources we're going to run through today, and generally I'm going to move through those in chronological order. All of these will be linked in the description below, of course, and if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to like the video because it's free, and that actually really helps the channel quite a bit. Now, starting out with some reporting from Jennifer Griffin, U.S. Secretary of Defense, our new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, is currently in Brussels at the NATO headquarters, where all of the NATO defense secretaries or defense ministers are meeting over the next couple days. And he put out or gave a speech earlier today with some pretty notable points. He said, quote, "We want a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine, but we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war won't begin again." Now, to give you an idea of the area we're talking about, moving over here to deep state map, we can generally ignore all the green on this map for the sake of this conversation. This area, you have kind of a light reddish, we'll call it orange in a sense. This is territory taken by Russia since the 2022 invasion. This purplish pinkish here, Luhansk and Donetsk areas, and then down here in Crimea, is territory taken by Russia in 2014. So in this case, when Secretary of Defense Hegseth says that the pre-2014 borders are unrealistic, he's writing off Crimea and then a chunk of Luhansk and Donetsk, just to kind of give you an idea of the context there. Now, sticking with the reporting from Jennifer here, she said Hegseth stated, quote, "These security guarantees for Ukraine should not be provided through NATO membership, but must instead be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission and not covered under Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as any part of the security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine." None of this should really be shocking. It's notable that this is, I think, the first time we've had a senior U.S. official go on the record and lay this out as plainly as it is here. But if you've been following the war, this all kind of tracks with the general direction we've been moving in for some time. So it does appear that the United States is taking near-term NATO membership off the table. That is not a decision that the United States can make unilaterally, technically, but also the way the NATO alliance works is that every member state would have to vote for a new country to join the alliance. So if the U.S. is saying in this case they're not going to approve of Ukraine joining, then it's not going to happen. It technically would be the same if any country inside of NATO said we're not on board with this. In terms of peacekeeping troops, that's not really anything new. Generally, from the opening days of the war, there's been talk of how international peacekeepers might be needed to try to keep the peace. The challenge here, of course, is going to be that Russia is very opposed to any international troops on their border. Remember, one of the reasons they said they started this was because of NATO encroachment. They didn't want NATO getting any closer to Russian territory. It's hard to believe, if you've read through some of the Russian conspiracies, that they would really be able to differentiate and say, no, those NATO troops or from NATO countries are just peacekeepers. They're totally not building up for an offensive operation into Russia. So that would probably be a pretty hard selling point for Russia. We'll see where that actually goes. The last piece here, and Hegseth doubled down on this afterwards, where he said there's going to be no U.S. troops deployed at all. Now, there have been, throughout this conflict, U.S. troops deployed in various capacities in the western part of the country, tracking aid and military shipments moving into Ukraine, and then some around the embassy in Kyiv. But really drawing that line, even in the aftermath of this conflict, during the peacekeeping mission, there will not be U.S. troops there at all. Now, another piece here from Hegseth, again, a lot coming out from this one portion of the meeting today. He said, quote, "The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. As the United States shifts its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and the Pacific, respectively." This last piece here, I'm going to be very interested to see where that goes because it makes sense, right? There's a lot of different advantages that the United States has in certain regards, whereas our European allies hold in others. So how can we break that out most efficiently? The way that we've seen this recently, when you look at aid to Ukraine, is the United States is leading the charge in terms of military aid to Ukraine, which makes sense because we have the largest military. We spend the most on our military compared to all the other European nations. So when you look at that kind of in a standalone period of time, it makes sense that's where we would be contributing more. Very interested to see, because that would technically be a win-win for everybody involved, right? If we're able to identify the comparative strengths of the United States and our allies and leverage those towards future, hopefully, peace and prosperity in Europe as well as Asia Pacific. Now, there was a little bit of pushback here from President Zelenskyy, who said, look, this is not going to work if the Americans are not involved. The direct lines are that the direct quote, "There are voices that say that Europe could offer security guarantees without the Americans. I always say no." And it's understandable if you look at how this conflict has played out in recent years. If I'm Ukraine and I'm looking at this and saying, is Europe really going to come to the table and be able to provide the necessary military equipment, maybe even deploy troops to try to deter Russia, I can understand how Ukraine's a little bit nervous about that. Understandably so. Europe has contributed a ton, and we've generally seen an increase in defense spending across all European nations, especially those in NATO. But it's still a far cry as it sits today from coming anywhere near the military capabilities of the United States. And when you're talking about trying to deter a major military, a nuclear power like Russia, it's understandable where Zelenskyy would say, yeah, no, that's not enough unless Europe is able to do quite a bit more. Now, a lot of this current set was sparked just a couple days ago in an article that was published by the New York Post. I don't usually get the first source from the New York Post. I tend to go to like AP and Reuters and BBC even. I think this might be the first time I'm using New York Post, but they were the ones that broke this and put this story out first, so we'll, of course, go there. In this story, they said that on an interview on an airliner, on Air Force One, Trump revealed that he had spoken with Putin quite a few times, actually, and kind of laid out a desire to end the war. This was a kind of a funny way to end it. They said, how many times have you guys actually talked? And Trump said, I'd better not say. So kind of keeping that one under wraps. But he said that he wants people to stop dying, talking about Putin. And all these dead people, young, beautiful people, they're like your kids, 2 million of them. And for no reason. I don't know where the 2 million number comes from, if I'm being honest. We are going to get into the casualty figures here in a minute, but 2 million is maybe if we include all casualties. Either way. So generally what came out of this is that Trump talked to Putin, according to Trump, and Putin actually wants to see an end to the war because he cares about the Russian people and wants to see the people stop dying. Now, a couple things to hit on there. First off, a study just came out of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is a pretty reliable source of info. This is not like a random mill blogger or Twitter OSINT expert, no offense, guys, that throw out random numbers without a lot of data behind it. I should back that up. There's some real pros on Twitter that don't get paid and do incredible work hammering through data points. So I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the bad ones. But in this case, IISS is a professional organization, and they ran through a recent study that just came out 10 February, so just a couple days ago, where they rolled up Russian casualties so far, and based off of what they've been able to identify, they said that they estimate that a minimum of 172,000 Russian troops have so far been killed and 611,000 wounded, with nearly 400,000 severely wounded. Look, throughout this war, we've seen a lot of casualty statistics all over the place, and they've been pretty wild at times. And I think by and large, they've been inflated. I mean, for what it's worth, I think I saw like 1.5 million Russian casualties like a year and a half ago. Clearly, that was not the case. But from what I have been able to see, this is kind of the most notable, most professional organization to come out with a statistic this high that actually isn't that far off of what we've seen from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. So again, I'm bringing this up because we're talking about Putin over here saying he actually cares about the Russian people. And there's just evidence after evidence to show that he doesn't not only care about Ukrainian people, he doesn't really seem to care about the Russian people at all. This was just posted by St. Javelin yesterday or a couple days ago on X, showing that we are continuing to see Russian soldiers, crippled Russian soldiers, thrown into the assault to move. These guys are moving towards Ukrainian lines, right? you're just going to get shot down. You're just going to get hit with a drone. So it's hard to see something like this. And we've seen quite a few videos like this at this point, to include Russians that are captured. One the other day, Russian was missing an eye from a previous attack. His face was half mangled. And he said that he was being thrown back into the assault. So it's hard to look at that and say, yeah, of course, Putin clearly cares about his people, which is an important aspect here, because we're trying to figure out how is a negotiation going to come to fruition when one of the groups is like that, is of the mind of Putin. And that's what we're starting to see. You're going to notice throughout this video, there's going to be a lot of ups and downs. It's going to be generally positive for Ukraine and then negative for Ukraine. Positive for Russia, negative for Russia. That's just, I think, probably the nature of Trump as president, if I'm being totally honest. So Russia, in terms of some of these talks, have already pushed back. They wouldn't confirm or deny that Putin had spoken with Trump. So the takeaway there is a lot of times world leaders are very interested in saying, think Kim Jong-un, North Korea. And there's a lot of difference there between North Korea and Russia, but they want to celebrate it, right? They want everybody to know that they have talked to the leader of the United States, to President Trump, back when that happened a few years ago. In this case, if this call did happen, Putin is sitting on it and not promoting it at all. So there's probably a few different ways to read into that, assuming that the call did actually occur, or calls, as Trump pointed out. But an interesting piece here is this is where we start to see Russia kind of digging in. So we're seeing progress on the side of the United States. We're seeing progress from Ukraine. More on that here in a moment. But what we heard here was Russia's point man, and they don't actually name him in this article. I think they're talking about Peskov. But anyways, they say all of President Putin's conditions must be met in full before the war in Ukraine can end. Now, those terms have changed a little bit throughout the course of the war, but something to keep in mind as we're hearing a couple different stances here is if we go back to these maps, one of the kind of key components that Putin has, there's a couple key ones that Putin has kind of stuck with from the get-go. One is no NATO membership. Now, it does sound, according to Secretary Hegseth, that might be off the table in the near term. Another major one is the protection of Russian-speaking people in some of these territories, which has led to Russia annexing areas like Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk. So if Hegseth is here saying Ukraine is not going to get back to 2014 borders, that leaves open the question, what about 2022 borders? Because that would mean Putin giving up territory that technically Russia has voted to be a part of their nation. So you see where some of the sticking points might start emerging here. Now, there was actually some pretty positive news for Ukraine in recent days, but before getting to that, a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video. So there are companies out there that take your personal data, stitch it together into this like story of you, and then sell that story to whoever they want, no questions asked. This is things like what church or hospital you go to, political affiliation based off of rallies or events you've gone to in the past. Don't like that, top to bottom, seems like a bad thing, and that's why tools like Delete Me, the sponsor of today's video, are so important. Now, all of this is coming from a recent FTC filing against a company called Gravy Analytics, which is a real company. Of all the things, they went with that as a name. Anyways, they accused this data broker firm of creating and selling inferences derived from location data drawn about consumers based off sensitive characteristics such as medical conditions, political activities, and religious beliefs. So as some examples as to how they're able to get from A to B with these inferences, it was things like identifying when people went to a certain pharmacy during COVID quarantines. They could tell based off of other visits to certain stores at certain times that some people might be getting married or about to have children. In other cases, of course, going to churches or identifying a member of a political party based off of their attendance at political events. So this is what data brokers are using your and my information for right now, which is why tools like Delete Me, the sponsor of today's video, are so important. Delete Me is a subscription service that constantly scans the internet, and when they find your personal data available for sale, they have it removed. I use Delete Me, and in January alone, they removed 24 listings across 24 different data brokers with 273 pieces of my personally identifiable information. So if you want to start protecting yourself and your family from these data broker inferences, get started with Delete Me today and use code Preston for 20% off all consumer plans. All right, so also on February 11th, again, this timeline is crazy. There's so much happening. Representative Joe Wilson, U.S. Representative from South Carolina, Republican, tends to be relatively hawkish, has introduced House Resolution 1158, which he calls the Freedom First Lend-Lease Act. So what he's doing, and this might sound familiar because there was actually a Lend-Lease Act in 2022. It didn't get used at all. It looks like the United States just tapped into other funding sources, like the Drawdown Authority and things like that, to provide aid to Ukraine. That went away, or it's set to go away here shortly. So Representative Wilson laid out this Lend-Lease Act, again, kind of calling on history of when the United States really helped prop up the Soviet Union in terms of equipment to fight the Nazis in World War II. He's going back to that. The whole idea here is that this act would really cut red tape and allow for more materials, munitions, and weapons to move over to Ukraine in a much faster manner, which we'll see where this actually goes. We haven't seen the text of this resolution quite yet. This screenshot is all we have right now. We'll wait for that to come out, and we'll be able to dive into the details a little bit more. But shortly thereafter that, to kind of give you an idea, again, where Representative Wilson sits on all this, he said, quote, "A land swap between war criminal Putin and Ukraine to end the war is a fair deal. Ukrainian-occupied Russian territory for Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory." And that was actually mentioned by Zelenskyy, is kind of where he's getting that from, talking about just a few days ago, we'll swap one territory for another. Now, I did see this reported on, to go back to our map here, as Zelenskyy, for the first time, is ready to cede Ukrainian territory. That wasn't what he was getting at. If you kind of read what he was talking about here, he's looking at this up here, Kursk. Remember, just in recent days, we've seen kind of a continued push by Ukraine down here, expanding the bridgehead, if you will, a little bit further. This blue area on the map is inside of Russia, and it's controlled by Ukrainian soldiers. So what Zelenskyy is talking about is, hey, we'll give you some of that Kursk back. You give us, I don't know, Kherson, right? Zaporozhye or something. There's some trade he's talking about making there. Again, anybody who's followed the war should have kind of seen this coming. This was largely the talk right when this kicked off a few months ago, saying, I wonder if they're going to try to do this as some sort of swap. And now in terms of territory, like under their control, you can look just at this view, like how little it is compared to how much Russia has taken in eastern and southern Ukraine. But this is really a thorn in the side of Russia. Every single day, there are Russian mill bloggers and media personalities complaining, going, what the hell's happening here? Why can't we get the Ukrainians out? Because this largely was presented as it was just a little incursion. Don't worry about it. We're going to mass troops over there. We've now seen the North Koreans come and go and haven't been able to collapse this pocket entirely. So this little bubble in Kursk actually carries outsized potential in terms of what Ukraine could get in response. Unfortunately, it does seem like Russia's kind of dropping the hammer on that. Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, just yesterday said, quote, Russia has never discussed and will never discuss the topic of exchanging its territory. And of course, the Ukrainian forces will be expelled from this territory. Those who are not destroyed will be expelled. So again, I think we're going on 6 months now since Ukraine first pushed into Kursk. So the whole concept of pushing them out quickly clearly is not in the cards for Russia. Maybe long-term it will be, but that idea is on the table right now of maybe trading out territory for territory. But then to kind of bring it back down, again, the mood roller coasters all over the place here. Trump, in an interview with Fox News the other day, said some stuff that this is tough because you're talking about a war. People are dying day in and day out, and you really want to focus on what happens, not the nuance of what people say or how they say it or the pronunciation of certain words and what that might mean. I try to get past all of that. In this case, though, this one feels pretty important. In talking about a possible deal, Trump said, quote, they may make a deal, they may not make a deal. They may be Russian someday, or they may not be Russian someday. That is like the most extreme worst case scenario for Ukraine in this conflict is not that they would have to cede some territory in the east or they wouldn't get Crimea back, or even that some drone attacks might occur from time to time across the line of contact, even once peacekeepers are in place there. It's that Ukraine will cease to exist as a sovereign nation and will be absorbed by Russia. That is the worst case scenario for Ukraine. So again, words at times, nothing compared to actions, but I think this kind of brings home the idea or reinforces the idea that Trump is all over the place in this one. He has said and done some things that Zelenskyy probably loves to see, including in this article talking about, hey, look, they've got a bunch of rare earth, like $500 billion worth of rare earth, and we got to find a way to get that. And maybe we can swap that out with weapons or a long-term security deal for Ukraine. Nobody knows what that would look like quite yet. But if you're Ukraine, if you're Zelenskyy, you hear that and go, wait a minute, this might actually work out long term. And then at the same time talking about, who knows, they might actually be Russian someday is just got to be all over the map in terms of the signals being sent here. Now, another positive here yesterday was that the United States, the Trump administration, actually negotiated the return of Marc Fogle, seen here with a Steelers hat. I love that. This guy's been in Russian captivity for almost 4 years at this point, and they've got the Steelers hat for him. I just like that. Not even a Steelers fan. How important that is to him kind of resonates here. I think that's really cool. So anyways, Marc Fogle came home, and this is a big story no matter what, but it's kind of being viewed right now as maybe an olive branch, as a way to try to get some goodwill between the United States and Russia as these Ukraine negotiations are really set to hit overdrive here in the coming weeks. Now, a little on Marc Fogle here. He was a teacher in Russia and was arrested, an American citizen, arrested in 2021 after customs found his medical marijuana, and held for, again, coming up on 4 years now. What we've seen, by and large, this is awful, but it's also not surprising. And this is what Russia has done. They find ways to detain American citizens. Like, you couldn't pay me to go to Russia right now. They find ways to detain American citizens and then kind of hold them for leverage, which is exactly what they did in this case, which raises a question that we'll get to here in a second. But something that's kind of flying under the radar with this that I want to bring up in the Fogle story. Fogle said while he was incarcerated in Russia, he was in the hospital for more than 100 days and given more than 400 injections. What? I feel like that's something we should get some more information. Injected with what? Like, what scenario is that okay or normal or humane? So hopefully we have, happy to see that he's home safe. Hopefully he's healthy. 400 injections, I guess it kind of depends what that was. Hope to hear more information about this, because you hate to see anybody treated like that. It makes me even angrier when it's an American citizen unjustly detained and then injected 400 times in 3.5 years with God knows what. Now, the challenge with all of this is this idea of releasing this prisoner, this bargaining chip that Russia had, is that it was going to be some sort of, again, kind of an olive branch. Let's find a way to negotiate, find a way to come to the table. However, what we saw instead was as soon as Fogle was back home, Russia did what Russia has traditionally done anytime something like this has occurred, and they slung a bunch of missiles and drones into Ukrainian cities. Not military targets, Ukrainian cities, I should note. In this case, my understanding, according to Kate from Kharkiv, as of this recording, those missile strikes killed 1 person and wounded 4, including a child. So this is, in a lot of ways, could be viewed as Russia kind of driving home, we're not doing this quite yet. Like, we still have the upper hand. And that was really kind of reinforced by Dmitry Medvedev just a few hours ago, where he posted a telegram. And this is, again, Medvedev is technically in the Russian government today, former prime minister, former president, and considered at least a close advisor to Putin. So he published, quote, "Peace through strength, you say. Sometimes this concept really works. For example, by demonstrating a real, not invented by someone balance of power, like today in Kyiv, after the arrival of our missiles and UAVs. Although even such actions are not to completely clear the minds of those illegitimate buffoons who, trembling with fear and drug withdrawal, talk nonsense on camera about exchanging territories." He's talking about Zelenskyy there, the exchanging land for land. "For such people, the only way to heal is to feel Russian again, on the advice of the U.S. president." So this is the challenge as we get closer to these negotiations. It does look like the U.S. is kind of softening their stance a little bit. I mean, we're talking about Hegseth saying no to NATO and no to U.S. troops in any sort of peacekeeping capacity. At the same time, you've got Trump talking about, hey, maybe we'll keep sending arms so long as we can get access to those rare earth minerals. But by and large, when looking at the Russian response, they're saying no. They're saying the terms have not yet been met. We're not there. We need more, and maybe we'll just continue striking Ukraine until we get exactly what we want. But that's all I've got for now. Again, if interested, every one of these sources will be linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.